understand what I said. La conferència de la professora Yuval-Davis serà en anglès, tindrà una durada d'uns 40 minuts aproximadament i tot seguit obrirem un torn de preguntes i podeu intervenir en la llengua que vulgueu, més o menys, si l'entenem, ens podem encarregar també de traduir. Moltes gràcies i que gaudiu de la conferència. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Good. Thank you very much for coming and listening today. I am very aware that English is not your first language. English is not also my first language. So if you do not understand anything that I'm saying, please don't hesitate to try and stop me and ask me to clarify. If you don't agree with me, which I'm sure maybe many of you would not, please do not stop me in the middle, but just hold it till the end, and I hope that we will have an interesting discussion at the end. There is a Chinese curse which says we live in an interesting time, and I think that these days are very interesting times. And what I'm going to say today is some kind of reflections of some of the things which are going on in our local and global world. I think here in Spain you are a little bit luckier, or still luckier, than in some of other places, the UK, of course, among them, post-Brexit UK, but of course these days in the United States, there is the so-called the leader of the free world is also leading us in the very different directions. And this is not the focus of my talk, but obviously, inevitably, I will mention it. But I want to start actually by reflecting on an article that already appeared a year ago. I think today it might have been a tiny bit less controversial, but when Marie Cohen published it in the journal Jewish Current more than a year ago, it created quite a storm, and it was called, Can Genocide Studies Survive the War of Gaza? And the reason that she said it is because there have been, and still is, although the power relations, I think, are slowly shifting because of the horrible reality, between those who were quite quick to observe that what is going on in Gaza is a genocide, and those who have been in complete denial. And traditionally, the main funders and also the main focus of genocide studies have been very much related to not just to the Nazi Holocaust, but also an attachment to Israel as a solution to the genocide against the Jews. So this has created a very big rift, which of course is continuing to go on. And I think it's not incidental that one of the main foci of these contestations and conflict has been Germany, because, of course, like Germany claimed after the International Criminal Court came with a statement accusing Israel with genocide intentionality, that this is not genocide. We, the Germans, know everything about genocide, and this is not it. And it was very interesting and important that very quickly after that, Namibia that used to be a colony of Germany before First World War, came and said, hey, the UN already years ago recognized that you committed genocide in Namibia, not just in Germany against the Jews. And much before you committed genocide against the Jews in Germany, you committed genocide against Africans. And of course, this is a very important signal for, I think, two things. First of all, theoretically, we see that Holocaust studies and post-colonial, decolonial studies are completely dichotomized. But if we look historically, they really have been a continuum and so-called mutual learning of practices and ideas throughout the history of imperialism, colonialism, and afterwards fascism in Europe itself. And therefore, not only the crisis within genocide, but I think the crisis within global studies that divide colonial studies with what happens in the West and in Europe within it is very problematic. And the second thing is, and I'm at the moment engaged with Ben Gidley writing a book about it, is that these contestations about Gaza and whether or not it's genocide or not, and whether or not what Israel has a right to do what it does because of its past and all this kind of thing, has become both a tool and a metaphor to contestations about a much more universal claiming of rights, which has been going on more and more, I think, since the beginning of the 21st century, at the same time where the fascist extreme right has started to rise with Europe and also in the global south as well in the post-Cold War era. So I think what we are talking about might be focused in the Middle East, in Palestine, Israel conflict, but actually it reflects a much more global issue. And I think it's not incidental that people that has nothing to do with Israel, with Palestine, with Arabs, Islam, Judaism, feel so much emotionally as well as politically that what is going on now in Gaza, it's not only awful, but it's also of extreme importance. Growing up in Israel, the whole community kept on asking, how was it possible that the world saw what happened to the Jews under Nazism and fascism and did nothing? But now we know the answer. And this is even more horrible. Now, when we talk about genocide, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide and which was used first in the Nuremberg trials after the defeat of the Nazis, his initial inspiration was actually the genocide against the Armenians in Turkey at the early 20th century. But very quickly, as I just described, the term genocide has become very much attached to the Holocaust of the Nazis. But it's very interesting. I don't know how many of you know this fascinating book by Philip Sand, the human rights lawyer, which is called East-West Street. And he described there Raphael Lemkin and Hersch Lauterpacht, who both of them studied law in Lvov, which is now in the Ukraine, but it changed a lot of rulers in the history of early 20th century. And Lauterpacht is the one who coined the term crimes against humanity, which was used even more than the term genocide in the same Nuremberg trials. And Philip Sand, who has been very important in the establishment of the International Criminal Court and the genocide in Rwanda and so on, has come out, even in relation to Gaza, when a lot of people can't forgive that, but he said, why do you hold on to the notion of Gaza? Let's try and stick with the notion of crime against humanity, because legally it's much easier to prove mass killings of individuals, which is crime against humanity, than the intentionality of getting away and trying to exterminate a group, which is what genocide is all about. But this is why it is so important also that the term is going to be not just crimes against individuals, but crimes against grouping. So this legal difficulty, because in most of the legal cases that have been about genocide, very small percentage has been enough to be proven legally. So this has been one of the main difficulties that people have been kind of holding on to, why they think they don't like the term genocide. But another difficulty that has been, as I mentioned, is that it has been so attached to the model, not even of the Nazi Holocaust, but of the model of Auschwitz. Because you have to know, and all my extended family, for example, in Lithuania, have been mass murdered, but not in concentration camps and death camps, but by mass killings or by the Eisengruppe in the woods in Lithuania and other places in Eastern Europe. 3 million Jews were killed in this way, in huge holes dug very often by Soviet prisoners and killed by not the German soldiers, but very often the local people who cooperated with them, because the German soldiers, being so cultured, felt very difficult to shoot people, although they were of course not people, but nevertheless in cold blood, and they needed to get drunk, and the locals got drunk much easier. And this was one of the reasons, and I remember reading it in the War Museum in London. This was one of the reasons that the so-called final solution of killing the Jews via industriously in gas chambers were invented in order to save the mental health of the German soldiers. And I think this is a very important, because it's also linked very much genocide, not just with mass killings and intentionality and groups, but in the case of the Nazi Holocaust, and I would claim now what is happening in Gaza, using the most advanced modern technologies, strategic engineering, in order to carry out what is happening. So because at the beginning, I mean, if you look now what is happening in the so-called feeding centers that Israel and the United States have established as an alternative to UNRWA in Gaza, and how it's been manipulated, it's very clear that it's a use of the most modern and sophisticated social and technical engineering in order for mass starvation. But when it looked like as mass killing, oh, this is not genocide. But of course, the intentionality has been there for much longer. But the third reason why it has been so difficult to accept that this is a genocide is because in identity politics, it's very difficult to perceive that the same people can be victims of racism, victim of oppression, victim of persecution or genocide, and perpetrators of them. So when I grew up in Israel, I said, Jews cannot be racist because we have been victims of racism all along. And I hear from many blacks in Britain saying absolutely the same thing, while, of course, we know that this is not the reality. And this is very important because this is where situated intersectionality comes into play. Because we don't just divide people into unidimensional, mutually exclusive grouping, but we see them as complex being in complex positioning in which their positioning as well as their identifications and emotions about this positioning, as well as their normative value system, are not automatically reducible to each other. Not every woman is a feminist, not every black is anti-racist, as some of the major people in the British Conservative Party including the ex-Prime Minister, can prove the case. So this is why situated intersectionality is absolutely vital in order to analyze social and political cases. But as I have argued, and unlike some other so-called intersectional feminists, I would definitely differentiate it between the analytical and the political. I see situated intersectionality as a methodological, epistemological tool, while I leave it to the politics of transversal and human rights politics in order to make political judgment. So before I continue to highlight some of the issues that I just want very briefly to outline what I see as the most important tenets of both situated intersectionality and transversal politics, so that you'd know what I'm talking about. First of all, unlike some of the feminists who worked on intersectionality, I don't think that it applies only to racialized, marginalized groupings, but to everybody. I think this is so, not just because I think that if we just keep looking at racialized minorities groupings of women and others, we are contributing to this surveillance culture, which is much easier and very often directed towards the powerless rather than the powerful. But also because I see power as relational and as inherent in all strata of society. And one of the other things which is very important in situated intersectionality, that we don't just differentiate between different groupings or categories, and some versions of intersectionality collapse groupings and social categories, which again I think is very problematic, but also because I think that in a way we need to look at the power relations within groupings, within social categories, and not just in between them. And of course, another important tenet is that we are talking about access of power that mutually constitute and shape each other in concrete situations, although, of course, ontologically, they cannot be reduced to each other. But the other thing is that there is no equivalence between these different axes of power. I remember when I first encountered so-called intersectional analysis in the UN conference on human rights in Vienna in the 90s. And they tried to make a model that how do you use intersectionality for policies? So it's a woman, you get 1 point. It's a black, you get another point. It's a rural, it's another point. It's a disabled, another point. As if being rural or in terms of class or ability and gender and so on, they are all the same weight, the same importance, the same moment in any concrete situation, with no fluidity, with no dynamic, with no interrelationships, which is so vital when we are trying to create any kind of social change. So situated intersectionality does not treat different axes of power in this way. Now, the other thing which is very important, and Patricia Hill-Cohen, I think, was the first one that articulated this in a very clear way, that intersectionality, like other feminist epistemology, is not positivist, but it is also not relativist. It does not deny that different situated gazes have different perspectives, but it does not give the same epistemological or an ontological weight to each situated gaze and say, oh yes, this is my truth, this is your truth. No, the more encompassing and heterogeneous in terms of positioning, in terms of identification, in terms of normative value, the different approaches to and the same social situation by the different kind of participant, we have a chance, we never reach there, to approach the so-called truth. Because it is never just in the gaze of one. There is no, Marx said that the proletarians have an ontological privilege that they know the truth more than the bourgeoisie. No, they never knew how power works in the center of the state. They knew better than those in the center the effect of this power, but they didn't know. The same thing, I remember sitting in a feminist seminar in New York, and somebody said, the pregnant black disabled woman is the one who understands best what reality is. No. We have to encompass and understand. However, this does not mean that politically and morally we take a neutral position, the look of all. And this is why we have to separate between the analytical and the political. And this is where transversal solidarity and other forms of solidarity come through. Transversal solidarity, a term that was first coined by Italian feminists who worked with both Palestinian and Israeli feminists as well as different sides in the former Yugoslavia conflict. They talked about solidarity across borders and boundaries, but between and among, they talk about feminists, but it can be also other grouping who share the same values. They don't share positioning, they don't share identifications, but they share the same set of values, and they have respect for each other although there is also recognition of the asymmetric power relations. So the terms they used were rooting and shifting. First of all, rooting, you reflect upon your own positioning, your own identifications, your own value system. And shifting, you attempt to view what is the situated gazes of those who are on the other side of the border or the boundary. And of course, it's not easy and it's not often successful, especially in very in very cruel conflicts that often happen, but it has been also powerful and successful in many other ways. But we should not mix this kind of transversal solidarity with what we call rainbow solidarity, which is not about shared value, but is that of human rights defenders. Whatever the values, whatever the identification, whatever the positioning, if people need, like now the people in Gaza, whatever we think about the politics of some of the people there, the first task is to share solidarity in order to elevate and stop what is happening. But we should not mix between these two kinds of solidarity. Transversal solidarity is long-term political alliance of people you trust. Human rights defenders' solidarity is what needed to be done at particular time and places. Now, to go back to the importance of situated intersectionality in order to understand things, I want to give you an example of two women I heard in a demonstration in Israel trying to block the lorries bringing food to Gaza. When both of them were interviewed, the first one said, "We cannot give them food. It's impossible. We don't want them anymore. We can't bear to live. As long as I live on this other side of the border, we will not be able to live, and it will be October 7. The only thing is to stop and that they will go away, be away, and so on." This is a very clear narrative of genocide, because there is an intentionality, there is a view of the existential danger of the other, and you want to get rid of them. The other woman who had engaged in the same activity talked, however, very differently, and she said, "We have to stop it. This is the only chance, the only lever we have in order to get back our kidnapped Israeli friend," and she had a family relative. "This is why we must do that." Now, this is not a narrative of genocide. This is a narrative of what I call necro-racism. What is the difference? The difference is that in the first narrative, the other is constructed as a member of a group that inherently is their existence mutually excludes your own safe and peaceful existence. This kind of narrative also say, yes, babies, but these babies are going to grow up and be Hamas warriors. So, yeah, so even if they're babies, it doesn't make any difference. The second narrative didn't focus on and didn't see the Palestinians as somebody very dangerous or whatever. They just saw them what in the Iraq war they started to call collateral damage. They are not important. They are not entitled to anything. They are not have their name, they don't have their identity, they don't have their needs. They are not important. The only important thing is to save our kingdom people. No matter how many people will starve, no matter how many people will be killed. So ontologically, this is the opposite of genocide. Because these people do not have identity, do not have importance, do not have rights. They are not dangerous because they are not human, really. They are not considered to be part of anybody. Now, before I move on to talk about necro-racism, which I think is a very, very important and neglected aspect of contemporary racism, I want us to say that different of racialization, I mean, obviously the ultimate logics of racism is mode of exploitation like slavery, or ultimate form of extermination like genocide and or necro-racism. Because very often in concrete situation, of course, the different kind of racialization and effects and practices happen together. I mean, the concentration camps were also slavery camps, and millions of slaves were also died on the way to the plantations and in the plantations. So we cannot, in practice, exclude it, but again, in terms of understanding what the issue are, we have to talk about it. And when we are talking about that, those who sit with very sophisticated computer programs and created this in Hebrew, it's it's arava ha'avara. Arava is starvation and ha'avara is transfer. Using the so-called humanitarian aid to feed that Israel and the United States now build in these new places in Gaza as a replacement of all the aids that used to come to people where they were. This one is used in order to transfer people to even more concentrated and very limited 3 zones within Gaza. And supposedly they are always accident and they are always blocked and they never get it right and all this kind of thing, but actually it's quite clear that it's part of a very explicit practice and program of doing it. So necro-racism, as well as genocide and all actually forms of policies, are multi-scalar. So the narrative of this woman, or these women in the demonstration, and the silence but the efficient practice of those who are responsible of designing the so-called humanitarian aid centers now in Gaza. There are different scales, there are different levels, but we should not just look at one level rather than the other. We always have to look at the multi-scalar and at the vernacular meaning of, in a pluriversal universe, that we always the same terms, the same category mean different things, but also the different meanings of people with different positioning, identifications, and normative values within the same place, within the same terms, as I mentioned about these women. Necro-racism in our world, however, is not limited to the so-called collateral damage in the various wars that have been happening in the 21st century and, of course, before. What we are seeing in the last, 2-3 decades is a growing number of people who are allowed to drown in the Mediterranean, to die in the desert, trying to cross between countries, and they are nameless, they are without identity, they are without any, of course, rights, and they don't count. This is even another kind of mass and growing manifestation of necro-racism. And this relates to, Maria mentioned that I've been working on what I call, since 2003, the double crisis of governability and governmentality of global neoliberalism. The crisis of governability has come about, and we started to feel it stronger after the banking crisis, the fact that states, although they might want to, and I think in Spain more than in many other countries, to represent the interest of the citizens, are able to do it less and less because the relative power, not of both supra and international organization, but primarily probably there's multinational corporations, have become more important in terms of negotiating some kind of coexistence. Although what we see now under Trump's government is a different stage, that they, multinational corporation moguls, are going directly to government. They don't just use government in order to play for their interest, because it didn't seem to be immediate enough. And it's very interesting to follow now the power struggle between Elon Musk and Trump in order to see different kind of mogul and different kind of economic and political interest and how they play up. So the result of it is that citizens feel that it doesn't matter to whom they vote often and whether or not they vote at all, because it's all going to be the same. And that's what I call the governmentality crisis, because neoliberalism tried also to, with the privatization of the state and so on, to tell them, this is your own responsibility. If you don't succeed, if you are not healthy, if your children are not doing well, if you are not wealthy, this is all your fault. And gradually also they stop buying this bullshit, sorry of this word. So this is when we see the start of what they call the populist bottom-up resistance of those, and unfortunately in the post-Cold War era, most of the populist powers have been from the right rather than the left. And the government from the top down trying to show that actually they do keep the interest of the people, and therefore there is more and more emphasis on security, on militarization, and on bordering. Bordering becomes everywhere, not just in the borders, but at train station, at place of work, at home. And the citizens, I don't know about Spain, but in many other countries, and in Britain, it has been one of the most kind of so-called pioneering in this role. A new citizenship duty is to be an unpaid, untrained border guard. So if you do not either don't spot or don't report that you spotted, that your tenant is an so-called illegal migrant, or your employer, whatever, you become a criminal. And if it happens more than once, you can end up in prison. Of course, the professional border guards who are paid, who are trained, when they fail, they don't go to prison, but the citizens do. So those, and the populist right, it's very easy to see those who supposedly do not belong as the ones to blame. So what we see is the rise of what Peter Geshe and others called autochtonic politics of belonging. Autochthony or nativist politics means that it's not specific national origin or even race or ethnicity. It's a much emptier and therefore much more flexible category. It just differentiates between those who belong and don't belong. This is why all the so-called new right parties always claim they are not racist. And even like the Reform Party in Britain now, the second in command and one of the main donors has been a black person. And they have also other people from minorities. And we see that like the conservative government before the present one was the most diverse racially and ethnically, but the most racist government ever in recent history of Britain. Because of this substitution of boundaries with this category of belonging. And interestingly enough, you know that Trump legally kind of removed all the diversity, equality kind of units from academia and so on, and they are trying now to put belonging as an alternative to diversity and equality. And of course, the danger of this, that when you belong, you feel very good and warm and safe. But the emphasis is, do you belong or you do not belong? And that's where the everyday border guarding come into place. And this is why the sense of existential danger has become so prevalent, because people all the time they look who do not belong, who is responsible to all the things that don't go right. And of course, this create more and more people who are in what we call in our work in bordering gray zone, that they are stuck between one state and another who do not accept them, or even they accept them, they never let them settle. It used to be that if you migrate somewhere, or if you are recognized as a refugee, eventually you got a right to live your life, your new life, in your new place. Trump now removed the citizenship of 500,000 people in the United States, let alone the thousands and thousands and thousands that already have been removed into horrible camps in El Salvador and other places. And the Prime Minister of Britain, I mean, the previous one were planning about removing them to Rwanda, extortionate the price, and the present one went to Italy to learn how they remove them to Albania, and went even to Albania, but the Prime Minister of Albania said, no, We don't want your people to, your non-people to come here. So we are seeing a complete flooding of people becoming non-people, of people who belong becoming more and more on account of people who do not belong. And Achilles Mbembe, who wrote a very important book about necropolitics, he connected it to the whole global working of racial capitalism, in which the racialization and to whom to belong and to whom to not belong have become a major distributive instrument of how much you get and how much you do not get. I just read today that Thomas Piketty, who has been one of the most important stratification scholar, is now doing a statistical data collection about how unequal the exchange between the global south and the global north has been happening all the time. But what Mbembe added to this racialization as a major distributive resources is the importance of governance power to decide not only how much you get, but whether or not you are entitled to live or not. And are you have a not just right, but when you die, do you die a grievable death, or do you die a death which is completely not accountable, not important, because you are just the end of what you, because of all what you are not entitled to. So this is the world, unfortunately, that we are living at the moment. I agree with Nancy Fraser that we are in a transition period in which the crisis of neoliberalism has been so strong, but no new system, although Trump is trying his best, has been yet normalized and came to power as a working global system. And all what we are talking about now is probably part of what is important. So usually when I lecture, I used to quote Gramsci about pessimism of the mind and optimism of the soul. I must say, and especially since last year at the beginning of the Gaza war, I cannot bear to talk about or to think about hope. So I think what we need is really the politics of care, because politics of the care is the opposite of necropolitics. And of course, and I've written and done about it, care and the politics of care is not simple and can be given to abuse, and power is not absent there, and so on. But instead of the duty of citizen to be unpaid, ungeared border guard, I think the duty of each citizen should be also as a carer, because we all need care when we are born, we all need care when we die, and most often in between as well. And given the topic that I spoke about today, I think two kinds of politics of care are especially important. One is of transversal solidarity with people beyond borders and boundaries who share our values, with whom we create, hopefully, a struggle for a better world. And secondly, the politics of human rights defenders kind of solidarity, to try and save as much as we can. And given the namelessness of the victims of necro-racism, I think naming and memorizing and remembering the people behind the anonymity struggle is very, very important. In Israel, my friends who have been at the forefront of resistance for the war for a long time started to bring pictures, individual pictures of dead children from Gaza to their demonstrations. And there was nothing, no slogans, no speeches, no waving of flag or demonstration that upset people than actually seeing the pictures of these dead children. People were thrown into prison from holding pictures of dead children. So let's fight against necro-racism and other forms of racism and all forms of genocide and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nira. Now we have some time for questions. Do we have microphone?
It's not quite a question. I just wanted to thank you very much for this talk. I think it's very necessary to hear that an academic who dares to actually take a stance on this issue now. And I've been here in Barcelona for many years, but I have close contact with my home country, Sweden. And I noticed that colleagues there are being silenced, and the whole necessary debate and action to condemn the genocide is kind of being framed as a lack of academic seriosity or rigor, or people say things that I cannot actually make a statement of this because it's not my field of research or expertise. So I would just like to ask you for maybe some advice. What can we say to those who are still quite dominant in a lot of European countries now who make this kind of declarations against what they really perceive as more activism than academic?
You know, there was what was called Father Niemöller, who had during the Nazis said, first they came for, was it the socialists, for the Jews, then they came the socialists, then they came, and then they came for us. The issue of academic freedom, if you look what is happening in Germany, if you look what is happening in the United States, let alone in Israel, and the extermination of all academic in Gaza and in Palestine in general. So I think people need to understand that what we're talking about here is not just about discipline or knowledge. This is about space for breathing, space for thinking, space for action. And I think that's what they need to hear. I am a co-coordinator of a group in Britain called Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment. Hostile environment, one of the, when Theresa May, before she became a prime minister, she was a home secretary, and she said, we have to create a hostile environment to the immigrants so that they would not want to live here. Of course, hostile environment to all racialized people existed much longer than that, but we kind of took this expression, and we are, we've been working now since we wrote first a report and meeting, then in COVID we moved more to webinar, but I'm coming back to London for our annual conference. This is something that we can't afford to ignore, yeah. Of, of course, I mean, like Zygmunt Bauman talked when he tried to show that genocide or the Holocaust was kind of a modern one. He said society is like a garden, and garden has weeds, and you have to get rid of weeds, and the, you know, he saw that the victims of Nazism as weeds. But this deeper personalization of the members of the group which looked for genocide is an identity politics depersonalization which homogenizes and reifies all the members of a particular group. The necro-racism is homogenizing and reifying of people who do not conceive to be belonging to any group. This is the difference. Because it is the opposite of what I talk about, the elasticity of autochtonic politics, that people can be, you know, white or black or religious or secular, whatever, as long as they considered to belong. Here, the other who had led to die, you know, sometimes when they saw a child died, it can move people, and suddenly it becomes human. I remember there was this little child who was found dead on the coast of Turkey, and it became a major kind of thing for a few days until the tabloids came out with teenagers that looked like adults and say, this is, you care about children, this is what who pretend to be children as unaccompanied minors who are coming and taking over the country with and immediately people forgot to be sorry for children, because again it became this kind of non-existent kind of danger, amorphic danger of those who did not belong. So here it can be Africans, Asians, Australians, Americans. It doesn't matter if they're in the desert, if they're of course, people who have money usually are not among them. They can bribe and they can get more secure boats or more reliable guides through the desert. So I'm not saying that intersectional analysis does not apply among the victims of necro-racism. However, I think this is a very important difference, because the people are let die, or people are not allowed to become citizen or to stay in the country. Because like in Britain, it used to be that all the danger was supposedly against the illegal migrants. But no, the last government in Britain and this one, talking about a cap of legal migrants as well. Although they are very necessary economically or carers or socially and so on, and everybody recognizes it, and as a students for the survival of universities. But no, we have to put a cap. There cannot be too many of them. So it's them. It's the amorphic them, those who did not belong, the alloctons, not the autochtons. And this is very important, because we used to think about racism, and still now there was debate. Diana Abbott, the black MP, said, oh, only blacks suffer from racism. Other people just suffer from prejudice, which of course complete nonsense is historically and also today. But the thing is, the necro-racism is so important because you don't even bother to imagine how they look. You don't even bother to see that they are in danger. They just don't belong. We don't care. And this is horrific. Yeah.
No? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Following this discussion, I'm a little bit confused about first the difference between necro-racism and necropolitics, in the sense that seems that necro-racism is based on this idea of disposability of life of some. So where is the difference in which sense this necro-racism is giving something more to the analysis and conceptual terms, and also in the sense if
Sorry,
it's-
necro-racism rather than necropolitics?
Yeah. And related more on genocide, if these people are not considered people, they are beyond the threshold of humanity, they are considered animals in some sense. It's difficult to understand how there is no a category on which is based this denial of their humanity. Even if this category is not so clear, it's not that they're part of black race or some other specific race, is more mixed and it's more elastic depending on the period of time, on the context. But still, it's difficult for me to understand how this category is constructed without having something in common, that maybe is the fact that they are not white.
Yeah, of course, as I mentioned, in concrete situation, everything is very interrelated, and people are killed as a collateral damage. They attempted to save 3 people who were kidnapped, and 250 civilians, mostly women and children, died as a so-called collateral damage. But this collateral damage didn't matter because anyway you want to minimize the numbers of Palestinians in the thing. I mean, the dehumanization does not necessarily bring images of animals, like the image of Palestinians, especially Arabs in general. I've done studies after 9/11, is of terrorists. So terrorist is not a particular animal. It's just somebody with uncontrollable aggressive instinct. I've also remember reading an anti-Semitic book written by some of the Black Power movement, who said that the Jews are descendants of the Khazars, who are Slavs, and Slavs are the most aggressive people in the world, and the Khazars were the most aggressive among the Slavs, and the Jews are the most aggressive among the... I mean, so you have all kinds of demonization. It doesn't have to be animals. And the necro-racism, I think usually there are no specific images. That's part of the thing, that there are no specific images. They're just, not only they don't have entitlement, they don't have image, they don't have identity, they don't exist. This is why in Israel the reaction to bringing pictures, because for more than a year, people completely denied that except for Hamas terrorists, anybody is being killed in Gaza. And then all these hundreds, of course thousands, but the pictures in the demonstration of actual children with names, with affiliation, with humanity. They couldn't deal with it. So you're right that it's not a neatly either or. But I think definitely when we are looking at the global migration, the gray zones, the migration policies, I mean, obviously in Gaza, the issue of genocide, and in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, the whole issue that each side would rather the other side did not exist. And of course it's asymmetrical, both historically and in the concrete situation. But when we are talking about the crisis of global neoliberalism, when we talk about the global necropolitics, and that brings me to your first question, that necro-racism is a particular manifestation of necropolitics, because necropolitics is a deciding who is to live, who is to die, who is to expose, and so on. But when we talk about globally, I think today necropolitics and necro-racism is more important in terms of scale, not in terms of essence, of course, than genocide. Genocide is very important, a very acute situation that is happening now in Gaza and the Palestinians in general. But when you look globally, I think the whole issue of gray zones, of everyday borderings, of necro-racism is something which is all too often not given enough attention. It's too gray, it's too blurred, it's the background. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a question in this, maybe we can fish one out, but what you're saying now made me think about the fact that what you're saying is that the necro-racism, necropolitics, whatever you want to call it, is a wider phenomenon, and that is something that we find in Europe as well as Israel. As
well as in Africa?
Yeah, of course.
Asia.
Yeah. What I was thinking when you're saying that is also that the example that you were giving basically was one between two right-wing women, right? In this I'm assuming that they're right-wing because these blocking of food is right.
Yeah.
However, the necro-racist traits that you described could be found among liberals in Israel, right? Like most of the demonstrations, the anti-Netanyahu demonstrations and so forth are characterized by precisely that trait, that the people who are slaughtered in Gaza don't really figure in their calculus at all, right?
Absolutely.
And so somehow it's not just that that's a more widespread phenomenon, it's also that literally enables genocide, right? Those are the people that refuse to sit together with any Arab parties and coalitions, and therefore will never topple Netanyahu. Those are the people that allow for genocide to happen.
Absolutely. I was in Israel the May before October 7. I came to another research trip, and I was actually there in October 7th. But before that, in May, and this was the height of the kind of protest movement and so on. And I was part, of course, of the bloc against occupation, but this was a small minority. When I went to the main stage, they thought that waving Israeli flags is going to make people joining the cause. And they wanted Netanyahu out, but they wanted substitutes that inherently had the same exactly policies. So, yeah, I absolutely agree with you, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing and engaging and moving lecture. I guess I have a bit of a selfish question about conceptual understanding, because you were talking about the double crisis of governability and
mentality.
Thank you, governmentality. And then I really loved how you spoke of bordering as this forced distribution of unpaid and untrained labor of border enacting onto all citizens. And I wanted to ask you, isn't this the triumph of governmentality? If the state
governability or governmentality.
Governmentality in the Foucauldian sense that you don't need a really strong state to act as the major oppressor, because power is being enacted on so many levels and in a fragmented kind of way. Isn't this?
I know. I mean, what is so scary is the normalization of that. And therefore, as you said, you don't need to be forced, because this is considered to be how things are. I remember when surveillance was first introduced in the university, and the university administration, at least in my university, but I think it was most of British university, understood that we are not going to take attendance of students and then report in order for some of our students to be deported if they don't attend lectures. So they just created machines in which each student had to put their card when they go into the lecture. So we don't have to take attendance. There are specific administrators, and they don't see students. They just see statistics. They just see, you know, ticks of cards. So it has become a new job for the because of course the administration and the neoliberalism, neoliberal universities, it's the administration which expand and expand and expand. I mean, there is less and less teaching or facilities for students, but the administration. So this was one of the first kind of expanding. So you're right. The normalization of this bordering is what. This is why our task. You ask about what is the task of in all disciplines of academia, is to name it, to denormalize it, to problematize it, to ask, how come we shouldn't accept it? Yeah. But then we don't have power to change it, unfortunately, very often. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just had a quick question, if you could clarify, going back to necro-racism. You mentioned that it was ontologically opposite to genocide. And I guess I'm just wondering, because in necropolitics, Membe talks about how the deployment of necropower creates this death world where people's deaths are legitimized before they take place. And my understanding is that this forms the basis for legitimizing genocide. So if necro-racism is a different manifestation of necropower or necropolitics, I guess I'm struggling to understand how it would be ontologically opposite.
I mean, Membe give different examples. I mean, and the colonization of Palestine is one of his examples, as is slavery, as his suicide bomber. I mean, he does talk about very different kinds of power of death and how it affects different people. And this is another answer to the previous question. What's the difference between necropolitics and necro-racism? Necro-racism is a particular thing. Necropolitics is a much more heterogeneous and wider phenomena, which I think is such an important addition both to Foucault and to racial capitalism and so on. This is why I think so highly of Mbembe. Yeah.
Thank you.
And the other reason I think so high for him, because like I think Bauman's work, for example, on modernity and the Holocaust is very, very important. But I think that the Eurocentrism in his work has been extreme. For example, he never would make the connection between the Holocaust and Namibia, which has been happening. He saw it as a modernity and Western and the West, more or less kind of the same as always, except even Hannah Arendt saw that the practices of that started in colonialism have afterwards shifted to Europe, but Bauman did not. Mbembe acknowledged, but of course he is much later than Bauman. I mean, and yet we should continue to criticize Bauman for that, because I think the division of the world into the West and the Rest in this kind of dichotomous way, not just in Bauman, but in the opposite, in the post-colonial studies, is very problematic, because they completely ignore power relations and racialization within the West. Everything is just, on what happened in the Global South. So we have to start to work with a much more fluid and dynamic, to use Bauman's expression, liquid kind of description of the globe as a whole, while see the asymmetries of power, while see how things, but we cannot just see white over black, north over south, as very, identity politics is very, very dangerous, yeah.
More questions? I have one
question, if I may. Actually, I have two questions. Thank you very much, Nira, for this really extraordinary presentation. I had one question is in relation to this differentiation between necro-racism and genocide.
Yeah.
So from the perspective of the victims, from the perspective of those who are being killed, but also not only them are being killed, but also like their built environment and natural environment is also being destroyed. So why this differentiation matters for those that are victims?
It matters very much. First of all, you know, before we talk about necro-racism, Agamben talked about all these people with no entitlement and so on as bare lives. And many of us thought it's important, but we also criticize it because it did not give any agency to the victim. It just saw it from the point of view of the other. Now, when you look what in Palestine, the Palestinian wants their own independence, they want their own state, they want their own society. The people who drown in the Mediterranean want to come and live in Britain or in France, and they want to claim the right of humans, even of minoritized and racialized groups, to live in a pluralist society and not just the state that belongs to them. This is a very different project. So that's, I think, of course, when you talk about collateral damage, I have no idea who, among those who died in Iraq or in Palestine, collateral damage, what were their political project. But when we kind of compare those who tried to migrate to Europe or United States and so on, or Australia or whatever, and those, they want to live, the right to leave their country. And those, they want to have the right to live in freedom and self-determination in their own country. This is two different political projects. Both of them I approve of.
Another question, which is in relation to gender. How do you see that gender is interrelated to what you have explained? Or also I had the question of how do you think that feminist theory or feminist concepts that we have been developing for decades, also you have been developing, how can they help us understand what's happening?
Well, definitely situated intersectionality is, as Leslie McCall says, probably the most important theoretical contribution feminist theory have done to general social theory. So that, secondly, of course, I did not analyze any kind of specific thing. I mean, of course, if I described these two women in this, I could have explored more the gendered aspect of the political protesters who are women versus others. I definitely the sexualization of the victim, the sexualization of warfare, the focus of women and children as always innocent and apolitical kind of category. All these are gendered, very clear gendered category and so on. But, you know, you gave me 40 minutes. So yeah.
Like the last question, because it's already past, I think. No? Thank you very much again. Ara ja pica-pica aquí fora, si voleu.